Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the director of the Brunswick Group, Dick Storike-Barton.
The wellness of society, and also the do no harm rule, which means how do you avoid the bad part. For example, in digital, we've calculated that the OECD 14% of the jobs are at stake of being basically displaced by technology. But 1/3 of the total jobs are in danger of being disrupted. So about half of the total workforce is going to suffer the consequences of the advance in technology. It's massive. How do you take advantage of, let's say, the best features? How do you avoid the bad part? How do you help digital become a force for equality rather than inequality, for gender parity rather than discriminate against gender? How do you make the digital work in favor of higher productivity and more competition rather than winner take all type of logic when you do not have competition? These are the kinds of things that regulators are thinking about, the governments are thinking about. And I fully accept I would say, guilty as charged, that the governments are behind. In a way, they always are, but in this particular case. But don't underestimate the capacity of the governments. If the governments actually perceive that there is a moment in which a particular technology, a particular progress, advance, or whatever it is, innovation, is actually affecting wide swaths of the population, they will act. And then what happens is that because they always act with a very heavy hand, they will act perhaps somewhat, brutally. So the way not to have this happen is precisely, rather than either ignore the regulators or poke fun at the regulators, whatever, I would say try to educate the regulators in the involvement, listen to the regulators in terms of what they would like to achieve, and also listen to society at large, because in the end, the regulators are going to be speaking on behalf of society, on behalf what they understand is their job is going to be about that. So the promotion of the technology, the information about the technology, access to the technology, so that it is not just the privilege of a few that can benefit from it. The skills to deal with the technology, preservation of competition, the promotion of STEM, of the girls,
Sure.
STEM in particular. All these are public policy issues, and all can be better achieved with full cooperation and coordination with the industry itself.
Well, let's actually...
Not only with the digital, but also with all the companies that use the technology.
Sure. Let's bring in John to hear from one of those industry voices. So how does MasterCard view this future? What do you see as the biggest sort of social and economic consequences of that disruption? And how is MasterCard going about responding to those?
So one of the clearest benefits of the digital revolution in the payments industry has been the financial inclusion benefits. Because one of the loneliest places to be in the world is unbanked and trapped in a cash economy, because you are at risk of all sorts of fraud, and you are disconnected from the global economy. So what we have seen around the world is that by digitizing payments, your mobile becomes both a payment device, and for small merchants, it becomes an acceptance device. And connecting both small merchants and unbanked citizens has created a huge opportunity to address financial inclusion. So in terms of social benefits, that's one of the clearest.
Would you say that you are a technology optimist when you look at the future?
Well, we describe ourselves these days as a technology company. So I wouldn't be working there if I weren't a technology optimist. So I would say yes.
Excellent. Well, before asking Angel about this question, we were discussing this backstage before we started. I understand MasterCard's doing some interesting stuff in AI. And obviously, AI is the real hot button topic at the conference. Everyone's talking about AI and the future consequences of that. How is MasterCard thinking about AI? How big a piece is that going to be in that future strategy for you?
And let me say up front, I'm not an AI expert, but I do know that we've made some acquisitions in that space, specifically to bring inside the company technology that we deploy to protect card users against fraud. So there are a lot of uses for AI, but we are using it to protect consumers.
Right. Are you worried that AI and the next wave of emerging technologies is going to overwhelm the capacity of the existing institutions, including the regulators, to manage all of these challenges?
You can't take a position that it's going to be overwhelming to deal with it. You have to take a position that you have to understand what you're talking about. AI itself, like every one of these issues, it's a universe, And then whether you're talking about payment systems, or whether you're talking about creating life, or whether you're talking about, and then there's ethical issues and big red lines, or whether you're talking about simply machines learning more about how to do things better among themselves. So the question then again is, governments have to understand what is involved. They have to understand the technology. They have to understand the implications. They have to understand the limits. That is very important, the limits. How far can you go with the technology, even if you could go further, but where does society put the limits of what you can do with this kind of technology? And then last but not least, again, how do you use it for the benefit? How do you use it to avoid the harm, and how do you use it to leapfrog? How do you use it for education? How do you use it for health? How do you use it to have children learn more, and not only just by memory, but also to do more about what it is that they can do with what they know, and how and the emotional skills, social skills, all these things. And AI can help a lot. Digital in general, technology in not just of cyber type, but also in general technology, advances in technology. And then last but not least, the cutting edge, which is could be AI. So basically, I would not take the view that the question is overwhelming or not overwhelming. The question is, how do you approach the challenge? Today, governments have an enormous challenge. Some of them do not fully grasp the importance and the size and the implications. Some of them are already, advancing, and actually leading.
Who do you think is doing the best job there? Who's at the front of that?
Well, it's almost a cliche to say that the Estonians, are leading the charge. I used to remember that their president Ilves, was but the ultimate plugged-in, wired-in guy. But basically, I would say that it's in the U.S. where things are happening.
Right.
Where there's more vibrancy, where there's more, and where more things happening at the same time, and therefore, where then eventually things kind of become more widespread, and then they become, well, if not part of the norm, but at least they are more. They leak down.
Right.
So I would say the United States. There are places like Israel where all these things are happening. There's wherever you have a very large military complex, that helps because your base is bigger. But I would say when you have all these research institutions, and when you have the idea of the startups, is so appealing, and you have societies, and that's very my own country, Mexico, but also in Europe, when you fail once and you get this stigma for life, I remember Jean Candel in Jerusalem that was telling me, well, basically, if somebody has not failed twice, we don't give him a capital in order to get his startup going, you know. So the whole logic about, and in the US, I think this is very much alive and well. So I would say, yes, this is where it's really happening, or where more things are happening. Silicon Valley,
Right.
you know, your nest there.
Totally.
You know.
Could I quickly add to that? I mean, one area that hasn't been raised yet today is digital identity. And we're rapidly at a point, I think all of us can relate to, not being able to memorize another password for your login for whatever app or service you want to use online. And so there's a lot of interest right now across many industries looking at how to solve the digital identity problem. In order for the private sector to address that, it really needs to be enabled by government. And Australia, from what we have seen, Australia is the government at the forefront by creating a regulatory framework that allows the private sector to innovate for the benefit of consumers, to create a digital identity that you can use online that's, one, easier, but two, better protected. And in contrast, the US is actually very far behind. The US hasn't looked at how to address its own systems, so that it could enable the private sector to innovate and provide these solutions.
Interesting.
I would say Europe is in the middle, certainly Estonia, but the countries we've looked at, Poland, Belgium, the UK, are also taking leadership positions on digital identity.
Interesting. So I would be remiss as a Silicon Valley guy not to ask a question here about blockchain technology, since it is the other buzzword.
Of course, yes.
To what extent do you see blockchain as an important part of that?
We have big investments in blockchain. We have a number of patents in that space. We haven't yet deployed it, but we're looking at various different use cases, especially in the faster payments area. So we see this as a key part of the digital future for payments.
Right.
But
Interesting.
with blockchain, blockchain is not a policy. Blockchain is not a regulation. Blockchain is a tool. The question is, you have to make the tool part of the regulation so that you can then do the policy. And that can only be done by government,
Sure.
no matter how much you...
Absolutely. Which has been the big problem with blockchain,
Yeah.
a lot of utopian thinking.
And this is the problem. The other day we had at the OECD 2 or 3 full days of blockchain. We were blockchain up to here. And everybody was... And there were carriers, people who handle ports, people who handle 100 million banking accounts. All of them said, it's fantastic, it works. But if I don't convince Vincent, said the banker, and if I don't convince the port authorities, and if I don't convince the notary publics to give up the stamping of the thing, and the green copy, and the blue copy, and the yellow copy, and the pink copy, in order to deliver the bills of lading and things like that, then I will have to do everything twice. So instead of saving money, I will be actually adding to the cost. So I'm doing it to prove that it works, but if it does not become a regulation, then it will not work. And that is the part of the governments. That's where the governments have to catch up with the technology. And of course, they will be fought by the lawyers, they will be fought by the notary publics, they will be fought by, but all the powers that be. But that's where we're going, and holding back on that will only delay, and the ones who are moving faster are going to be the ones who get the advantage.
Right, absolutely. One question is around how the OECD itself is using technology internally. So I used to be at the UN before I went to Silicon Valley, and we used to go to a lot of conferences where people would talk about innovation and technology, and I would always think, I'm back in the office struggling to use Lotus Notes to do my email, this ancient tool that had been bought by the UN and was on this decade-long deal, which seemed absolutely ridiculous. I got a pop-up every few minutes saying, would you like to upgrade to Firefox as a browser, which had not been invented when this thing was launched. How is the OECD internally using technology to modernize and to innovate and really keep pace with all the things that are happening in the world?
I think if we could walk the walk rather than talk the walk, I think we're better at proposing, our motto is better policies for better lives. And we are much better at proposing to our countries, member countries, and other countries that come to us, what can I do about this and that? We're better than what we do. I think the world of technology is particular in the sense that that is where the gaps are greater. And I would say that we are perhaps like the UN.
A role
Well,
model.
no, nothing is like the UN. No, nothing is like the UN in many ways, good and bad and everything. But I would say that because we are a smaller outfit and we can shape up, faster, and we got a lot of people who are working on these issues. We're trying to see how we apply blockchain to ourselves, and we are apply with it. But I would say that we would be, yes, a certain distance behind our own recommendations, let's say, in
Right.
terms of whether we practice that internally.
Very interesting. So I'd love to open this up to questions. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions here. So I'll take two at a time. The lady here.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Asika Vrakova. I'm the director of the European Citizen Action Service. We are an European association, not for profit. So I'm not from the government and I'm not from the business. So therefore, my question to the speakers is, can you elaborate a bit more on your perspective of how you see the digital transformation effect on our democracies? We know that, yes, we know that citizens are informing themselves in a different way, that they're not very interested in politics as traditionally practiced, and at the same time, apparently technology provides new forms and possibilities for more cooperative decision
Thank
making.
you. Excellent. And this gentleman here.
Mark Fisher, G+ Europe. The examples that get quoted for being the most advanced countries when it comes to digital, Estonia, Israel, yes, the US, but also parts of the US. I've lived in the US. There are parts of the US that are amazingly 21st or 22nd century, and there are parts that are rather charmingly 18th century. Obviously, technologically, there is a systemic problem in reforming large countries just because of the cost of investment. And also, actually coming from Germany, as you probably hear from my accent, it's also actually there's a barrier in fully embracing the digital revolution in countries that already have the most modern infrastructure of the last pre-digital age, because of course there's a lot of investment that basically becomes useless and you don't want to let it go. Is there a real debate about this, and how do these countries deal with this, and how do they then get the political will to really to make the investments? Because obviously Europe will not succeed if it's just Estonia. Estonia has 2 million inhabitants, as awesome as they are.
Sure. Angel, you want to?
Czech Republic took 9 months to form a government. Mark Rutte, it took only 7 months to form a government. Angela Merkel took 5 months to form a government. The unexpected results of the Italian election, the unexpected fragmentation and the very dramatic transformation of the Spanish political situation, Austria, and more recently Sweden. The very dramatic expression, and not only in Europe, United States, Brexit, of course. And then Mexico, just results. We're all waiting for Brazil, especially for the second round. What does it tell you? There's so many angry people practically everywhere. All they are voting for is change, and even worse, sometimes they're not even voting. If a fraction of the 60% of the youth whose future was at stake in the case of Brexit had actually voted, they would have turned the thing around and we wouldn't be having these pains today, And I say this because I fought very hard for Remain, and we lost. But then what happened? Of course, the campaign for Remain was like they were trying to elect the prom queen rather than playing the future of the UK. It was very amateurish. But
Sure.
Still, what am I saying this? Because there obviously is a question of delivery, of services, of quality, of opportunities, of health services, yes, but also of education, but jobs. The differences, the inequalities are growing rather than shrinking. So what you have is a situation where you have a lot of people who are very angry, a lot of people who are very dissatisfied, and digital has the potential to help you bring it together, or has a potential, like it has happened already in many places, in many instances, where they widen the differences because the access is biased for those that already have the access, and therefore it's going to just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So the question of challenging the democracies is yes, but again, don't put digital in democracy. It's how digital can help us with public policies that are more effective, so that they do not challenge the democracy and we do not have the completely disparate results with elections that we're having today, where the whole of our values are at stake, and everything that we believe in, everything we built over the last 100 years is being cast doubts on.
Sure.
And
I'd like to bring in John, actually.
Maybe take on the second question, maybe the first question too, what do you view on?
Yeah.
I'll address the first one.
Lots of angry
and the
people.
second one quickly. Just very practically speaking, I talked about financial inclusion earlier, but I also think digital payments, which is the area I know best, if you look at how governments can deploy digital payments to improve the experience of citizens dealing with their government, whether it's making a payment to government or in some parts of the world receiving a benefit from government, making that more efficient, more standardized, and more protected against fraud and abuse is a definite benefit. Also, to the extent that payments are digitized, the more that is increasing, you'll see a decrease in the so-called gray economy, which will be an automatic benefit in terms of moving fraud and crime out of the system, but also generating more tax revenue. And the third area where we've seen it is in the area with refugees. We've done a lot of support in the refugee space to provide cards so that benefits for refugees are digitized. And what we are finding is that by simply enabling that way of making a transaction, we have ensured that the benefit is actually getting to the people who need it. And in many cases, it's the woman of the household putting her in charge of that card to make sure that the funds are not misused for some other purpose. But also just being able to track that the funds that are provided by multinational institutions are actually being used for the purposes that they were intended. So I think there's great benefits for society and democracy through the digital revolution. On the second question, it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it in terms of the size of the country, and I'm not sure that I think that matters. But I do think your second point is very valid about where countries are on their sort of innovation journey. And I think of China in particular. I lived in China for 5 years and left in 2013. And when I left, I wasn't aware of anyone making a payment on their mobile phone. And now it dominates the market. I mean, it's a $1 trillion market with companies I had never heard of before. And this is just in a 5-year span of time. Whereas in the US, you'll find very few people, maybe the millennials or whatever generation is before them, are doing payments on their mobile phone. But certainly my friends are not doing it very often.
In the case of our German friend, in the case of a country being very large, do not underestimate, first of all, the capacity of the private sector simply out of competitive pressures to catch up. The catch-up. Now, when you are in the business of payments, of course, you have to be kind of the cutting edge, because then the other guy will eat your cheese, But even just any activity that you may be on, because they're all susceptible, even the more, sector one, agriculture. Everything can be, you can use digital, or you can use the technology to apply to every sector. The US, Germany, for example, is a very good example also. When you have very strong competitive forces, and when basically, I would say you have intelligent regulators that understand the challenge and basically have an idea that they will regulate for the benefit of the public, but they will not stifle innovation. This is the very critical balance that you have to establish. But I would join John in saying perhaps the size, because the United States is a bunch of countries, it's a bunch of areas that states, every city, is like a different country, and the mayors have capacities and the governors have capacities, but then the national regulators have capacities. The public has a capacity. The people, the companies are dramatic innovators. They're pushing the thing through. So I would say that the more vibrant, the more modern. And then, of course, as you said, you have 18th century things happening but 22nd century things. But it will tend to move ahead. Smaller countries, yes, you're right. Estonia is fantastic, but it's not necessarily representing what's going to happen with Europe or with the rest of the world. But it's interesting that you can have a community that can actually have that happen.
Sure. Let's open it up to 2 more questions. Here.
Hi there. It's a point that Angel brought up, but I guess it's a question to all 3 of you, actually. You talked about the need for regulators to engage with society and society to engage with regulators. How do you think you can ensure that you get a plurality, I guess that's a word, it sounds like a word, a plurality of voices from society and not just a narrow set of interests represented towards a single regulator? It is not a part of people's general anger that we're seeing across the world at the moment because they feel unrepresented and because they feel that their voice is not heard.
Right. I think that's
let's take one more question. This gentleman in the center here.
Thank you. My name is Ziv Tirosh. I am the CEO and founder of a startup from Israel. And we're in the fintech and travel tech area. I'd love to talk about it, but I won't.
Thank you.
Just one sentence. We are completely disrupting VAT refunds for tourists through digitization. And we deal with that in first world countries, but also in second and third world countries. And the question is, what do you guys see with digitization creating a bigger gap or diminishing the gap between first world countries, OECD countries, and third world countries? And what is the OECD doing to diminish the gap here?
Interesting. Let's start with John.
So on the first question about plurality of voices, I think that's a key issue, and we face it all the time, because in the space that we operate that's regulated, what you find are sort of 2 big sort of commercial sides of the debate being the focus of government attention, and those industries being very active in their advocacy efforts. But what is often lost in that debate is the voice of the consumer. And how to get the voice of the consumer louder in those discussions, I think, is a key challenge that we struggle with around the world. On the second question about disruption and various countries at different places in their economic development, I don't think it's a big challenge for the so-called first and second world countries. I just came back from India, and the amount of innovation that's happening there is incredible. And the US is Silicon Valley, so I don't think the first world needs to worry. But I am very much worried about the third world. And we are doing a lot of work in Africa, in Kenya in particular, again, working with small merchants who are disconnected from banks and therefore don't have a stable supply chain and don't have a credit history that would even allow them to have the sort of inventory that they would need to be as financially successful as they would like to be. And I do think our efforts are being helpful, and and we have other partners in that space, but I'm not sure that in and of itself is going to be sufficient to address the need.
Great.
I think you made a very good point. Regulators have the obligation to listen to all the voices. The greatest danger that we have is capture. And that's when the regulators, and it can also be the regulators, but also could be Congress, it can be the executives of a government, are captured either because of their commitments with the financing of campaigns or political parties or whatever, or out of ideology or ignorance. And the 3 sometimes can happen, sometimes all of the above. And the question, as you say, the regulator basically has the obligation to put the voice of the people in front of the industry and saying, this is what they're asking for, therefore let's give it to them, and talk to the industry so that you can guarantee. But it's the ultimate test, I would say. It's the acid test. And then putting the two together, bringing developing countries together. I think your example is very, very clear. India has just used the technology for 1.1 billion people who had absolutely, most of them, no identity. Even if you had checks for them, you couldn't deliver it to them because you did not know what their name was and what if they had an address. And now they can get the benefits, because of the program that they established. So, and it's not just for payments, but for everything, to have an identity, as you said in the beginning, just to exist, to have a name, to have a place in society, to have some dignity. So this is some of the things that technology provides.
Yes, I'm getting a irate person in my ear telling me we're out of time, but I want to take one last question if someone can keep it short, and we will ask both our panelists to keep the answer very brief. The lady right here.
Erika Widegren, I'm the Chief Executive of Reimagine Europa. We are running a task force on democracy in a digital society. And the Cambridge Analytica Facebook scandal raised a great opportunity, because all of a sudden regulators across Europe, and I think across the world, are ready to start regulating and also to do quite original and quite bold moves. So we're running this program headed by Professor Manuel Castells, who's been working on these issues for over 30 years. But my question is, one, do you think it would be possible to develop a European model of a digital society? And secondly, if so, what do you think, what would your priority be for that?
Great, and let's keep our answers to 30 seconds and we can continue after.
Yes, but not as a digital society in terms of the instrument, but digital in support of the type of society that Europe has decided to be, the way they want to go, the roadmap of where they choose, in terms of their way of conceiving themselves, not only as an economy, but also as a society, and also where they want their children to be. And there, use digital to support that model, rather than subjecting the model to the digital. The digital is a tool. It's not a policy.
Right, and the closing words of John.
Yes, and GDPR creates the conditions to do that. Indeed, it's necessary to do it as a result of GDPR. I was just in Washington this week with a bunch of other tech companies where the debate was, should the US adopt GDPR or something like it? So I do think it's entirely possible for Europe to create that. And just one quick example. We have created a trust in Ireland where we and other companies can deposit the data that we have. And we developed this trust with data protection officers, so it's fully GDPR compliant, so that big data analytics can occur, and the benefits of big data can still be derived for companies and for individuals, but in a way that's fully compliant with GDPR. So I think that's already the beginning of creating the type of society you were talking about.
Excellent. Ladies and gentlemen, Angel Guria and John Lepore.
Thank you very much.
Great, and just a word of housekeeping. That's it for today's debates. Those of you who were invited for the focus groups, they are about to start in the meeting rooms on the ground floor. There's going to be an award dinner at 7:45. Then there is a reception at 8:15, and then there will be cocktails at 10 p.m. So have a lovely evening.